your name is Emily, you live in Los Angeles. That's as specific as we're going to get. You are currently in the process of getting a doctorate for climate change and climate change solutions, which is excellent. You're going to be the ones to save us. I have some specific questions for you based on what we talked about, based on your research. So for those who are unaware, what areas are difficult to decarbonize and why?
Anything that is dispatchable. So anything that we use a dispatchable fuel for is going to be harder to decarbonize. So what that means is a dispatchable fuel is something like coal or natural gas or petroleum services that whenever you need it, you can burn it. And things like solar and wind are subject to intermittency. So you have solar power when it's sunny, or you have wind power when it's windy. Or if you want to get into like pre-commercial technologies, you have ocean power from waves.
Yeah, tides.
When there's big waves. So we have to find a way to take all of those things that come and go and then store them to use when we don't have access to them directly. So that kind of feeds into a lot of different issues, but pretty much anything that runs off of something that we burn it when we need it is going to be harder.
Interesting. And what do you think is the biggest obstacle to having entirely green technology and energy?
A lot of it is, I think, making the argument that it's necessary to front the overhead cost. Because when you stare at the numbers to implement stuff like this, it's, astronomical. I personally don't even have a concept of how much money that is. Like, it's so far unrelatable. But then when you start cross-checking it and you look at health benefits and dollars saved, and
the long-term
you look at
benefits.
Right. Yeah. So we tend to think Americans are so bad at this, but we're just like short-term instant gratification. What's going to be the market that's going to make us the most money? So it's a hard sell in a place where people are very individualistic. So the Green New Deal is my understanding. I'm not a policy person. So with a grain of salt, I would encourage people first off to read it because it's not very long and it's pretty clear cut. So anybody that's probably like a high school age can probably digest it and read it pretty well. So I would encourage that.
Excellent. Yeah.
Sorry?
I said, oh my God, the bar is so low. But yes, definitely for anyone who is seeing this, do your own research. It's very, very important, but also do research that, you're checking your biases and you're making sure you're drawing conclusions that are sound and you're not being easily influenced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Yes.
But basically
the gist of it is basically a policy outline that makes some very basic, very vague statements that climate change is a problem. The U.S. is responsible for a great deal of that, which is something that tends to be a little bit contested by people, is that, China burns more than we do. And yes, okay, sure, you can make a point, but that's not the point, right? Where Americans are the greatest carbon consumers. Like we consume. So the Green New Deal is kind of an attempt to achieve equity for disadvantaged groups, endorse clean technologies without being specific, and lay the foundation for greater policy change later on. That's basically because, more or less speaking, the U.S. doesn't have any national emission standards that are as sweeping as other countries. So we're kind of behind the ball there. We're very much like, the administration's now is very states' rights as a euphemism. It's very states' rights. So
not again.
It's trying to make up for lost time. At least that's my opinion of it.
How do we achieve net zero?
Whenever we start talking about net zero, it becomes a blame game.
And that seems to be a very interesting response, like similar with discussions of racism. People are way more concerned with being accused of being racist than doing things that are harmful and racist.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, it doesn't make any sense, to be honest, but a lot of the arguments from a lot of for lack of better words, like conservative Americans tend to be like, oh, well, we don't produce this much, or it's not that bad, or whatever. I think we need to look at the entire supply chain of everything that we consume in big numbers and start, making changes at each step rather than sweeping the blame away or not working together, because it is a worldwide problem, right?
Yeah.
So
I think it's going to be the greatest problem, aside from COVID, that we're going to have to face on an international scale. And I think changing this mindset of, I think we need a decoupling from ego of just, it doesn't really matter who shattered the china. The point is the dishes are broken and there's broken glass on the floor. We need to...
Exactly.
Yeah.
People that have taught me what I know about engineering solutions, and then policymakers, and then the public, and then industry. So like all of those players have to work together. So net zero won't happen unless there's a lot of communication. But it looks like, projecting based on things that I've read, that we need a lot of policy and incentives that are going to, at least in the United States, strong arm different companies into.
And for more risk-averse businesses, what do you think is a good way to incentivize them or strong arm
becoming
them,
clean,
as the case might have to be?
California there's a lot of work to be done, I will say that, but they are making good strides in policy. So AB 617 takes some of the money that is involved in the cap and trade and allocates it to the communities that are most affected by air pollution to invest in clean tech. So that's like one example of how things need to kind of work together. One is very like capitalist and the other one is very like environmental justice. And it takes, in the US, it's going to have to take both, because I don't think people will go on the idea that we can reduce some of our capitalistic tendencies. Like, I don't think that will work.
What's bizarre for me is climate change, technology and training and jobs and all of it is such a capitalistic gold mine of, let's say we give all the miners training to work, whatever, install solar panels or work with wind turbines or whatever. And yes, there's an initial upfront cost, but the amount of money long term it's going to generate and save in terms of health benefits, so that's somewhat frustrating when people are like, oh, this is like a social justice warrior snowflake issue, and it's like, not really.
Not really at all.
I'm a big fan of breathing oxygen.
Yeah. If you just look to California for that, we have a history of strong arming the rest of the United States into doing things, largely speaking.
Well done.
So I guess that's what happens when you control like the entire West Coast, basically. So if we have a state emission standard for cars, what are auto manufacturers going to do? Make two different cars to sell in the United States? No, they'll just make them to California standards, and then everyone will just have to buy them. So I think policy and incentives. There are definitely more qualified people to talk about the incentives, but we're at a point where it's like time is ticking. We've got to make some serious moves. That's why we have a lot on the line. In the US in November. Please register to vote if people are watching this.
Register to vote. Make sure you're still registered to vote. There are lots of websites. I will try and find them and link them, and just be persistent and use your democracy for good. Please, you're stressing the rest of us out just a little bit.
Like I said, a lot of policy framework that subsidies come out of, and a lot of learning curve analysis. I would say probably social science knows a lot better about that than I would.
Well, again, this is where we have to work together. Everyone has a
policy. Yes.
Fuel alternatives, and which ones are you most excited for?
Hydrogen and electrification.
Okay.
So using electricity as a fuel, and using hydrogen as a fuel.
Okay.
So top two. That being said, I would encourage people in the EU to check out the biofuel work.
And the biofuel is quite a good way to manage farm waste as well, isn't it? Like waste from agriculture can then be made into something useful.